Welcome to the podcast, Giving It Back is Dead. We're speaking today to Claude Grunitzky. Welcome, Claude.
Hey, happy to be here, Scott.
Nice to have you. Claude is CEO and managing partner at Equity Alliance. He's an angel investor helping many young entrepreneurs launch their startups over the last decade. Why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself, Claude? It's probably easier than me going through this long and fascinating CV.
Oh, Scott, well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be on this podcast. Giving Back is Dead is a great title, by the way. Well, my story starts in Togo, where I was born. My parents are Togolese, and most people don't know Togo because it's a tiny country in West Africa, only 7 million people. But I was born and raised there, and when I was a teenager, I moved to Paris, where I went to Catholic boarding school. And then I moved to London, and in London, I started a monthly music magazine. But music to me meant hip hop and black culture and how hip hop and black culture intersect with other cultures through the lenses of fashion, art, technology, various youth cultures. And then I moved to New York to launch a US edition of that magazine, Trace. Trace became very, very successful. It was funded by Goldman Sachs. And I sold that company about 10 years ago. But when I sold it, I decided, and this is why what you said at the beginning is important, I decided to help young entrepreneurs to launch their venture. And I became an angel investor. And now I'm actually a venture capitalist because I partnered with my mentor, Dick Parsons, to launch the Equity Alliance. And we invest in tech startups and VC funds that are run by women or people of color.
I think you should also mention something about the other initiative that you began, which was True Africa. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And that's you're still involved with True Africa, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, I'm still the owner and chairman and founder of True Africa. And True
Okay.
Africa is really interesting because I started it as a website to basically just publish articles and videos about global Black culture. And what do I mean by that? I started True Africa because I wanted to find ways to unite Afro descendants living in the African diaspora with Africans living on the continent, African Americans, Afro Caribbeans, Afro Brazilians. And essentially, I just wanted to champion young Black voices all over the world. And we've evolved the business model a little bit because the website with the articles and videos was not so successful. So True Africa started producing films and actually a podcast, a weekly podcast that comes out on Mondays. It's called Limitless Africa. So we've realized that it's really, really difficult to launch a digital media company based on publishing articles because the media is in crisis. And unless your name is Facebook or Google, it's very, very difficult to attract advertising. So we've been very, very humble in our approach to looking at the changes in digital media. But that's something that I'm really, really proud of because we've also launched True Africa University in partnership with my alma mater, MIT. And we give online courses to young African students all over the continent.
This is fantastic. So basically, you are among the thing. There are many things that interest me in getting you on our podcast, but among them is that you really are one of the experts in digital innovation and content, and you seem to have your hand on the pulse of how youth is thinking. So what we really want to talk about a bit is your attitude towards philanthropy. And as you know, why I've been interested in recording with you because you're one of the few people who have been involved in more traditional arts institutions, which intrigues me because the whole motivation of the podcast has been, as I believe our major art institutions are under threat of not being able to continue to attract funding from the next generation. So the fact that you have determined that you want to work within these institutions is what intrigues me. But that, just before we get to that, Claude, why don't you talk to me a little bit about you also are visiting, I think you're a visiting fellow at Harvard B School. And Harvard B School actually wrote a case study on one of your initiatives. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, after I sold my company Trace, there was a lot of interest in the fact that I'd been a first generation founder coming into the US as a penniless immigrant and then meeting a bunch of people in New York who helped me to turn Trace into a successful company that was quote unquote investable by Goldman Sachs and other very influential investors. And so Harvard Business School wrote a case study about my trajectory, really, just as an outsider who got to know a lot of people, who ended up being mentored by Iman and David Bowie and Beth Ann Hardison and all these very influential people in New York, and building a network of support, having people in my corner who helped me to get to the next level. And that was the subject of the Harvard Business School case study. And on the back of that, Julie Batilana, the professor at Harvard Business School who wrote that case study, asked me to join her in her new program that she was launching at the Harvard Kennedy School. And that program is called the Social Innovation and Change Initiative. And so for the past 7 years, I've been working with social change makers that are Harvard students looking to, quite frankly, just change the world through social enterprises that may be about racial equity or gender equity or solutions to climate change, climate justice, criminal justice reform. And that's been really interesting because I get to learn from my students. Teaching is also learning, and
Yeah.
working within that Harvard ecosystem has been extremely rewarding over the past 6, 7 years.
I think maybe we should talk about that more in a separate podcast. Because I think this is really interesting because what interests me, because that seems to me to have a lot of meaning, that kind of work. So talk to me a little bit about how you came to decide to be involved with Mass MoCA and went on the board at Mass MoCA. I think that happened in 2016. You went on the board at Mass MoCA.
Exactly. That's when I joined the board of Mass MoCA. And actually, to be honest, I had never really knew about Mass MoCA. I'd never been to the Berkshires, let alone to North Adams, Massachusetts, where Mass MoCA is based. But what happened was actually quite simple. I have a great friend who's also a great mentor, and his name is Timur Galen. And Timur had been a long time board member, a longtime trustee at Mass MoCA. And one day he brought me over. We drove from downtown New York, where we both live, to North Adams, and he introduced me to Joe Thompson, who was the founder and director of Mass MoCA. And Joe gave me a tour of the museum. I soon got to realize that it was the single largest museum in America. And I was just incredibly impressed by the experimentation that was taking place there. And then I just decided to get more involved. And before I knew it, I became a trustee. But what was really interesting about becoming a trustee at Mass MoCA was that when I joined, actually, there weren't any other people of color actually on the board. I was the only black trustee, and it was a very white institution that didn't really seem to understand how diversity, equity, and inclusion, as it's called now, actually worked. And even people who were looking to visit the museum, it's pretty remote part of Western Massachusetts, as I said. They were experimenting with what the museum was creating, and they were looking to discover that, but they felt isolated. People who were not from that area felt isolated, and people who actually became interns at Mass MoCA, who were maybe young black professionals or young black students, they felt isolated as well because there wasn't any sort of support system or other people of color that they could lean on. And so I really tried to work with Timur, with Joe Thompson, the then director, and also with the former chairman, Hans Morris, to find ways to bring diversity to Mass MoCA, to that kind of really incredible cultural institution that is sometimes perceived as the best kept secret. And so diversity was bringing new ideas coming from students, coming from innovators, from entrepreneurs, from researchers, and from artists who could really look at making it a lot more inclusive as an institution.
And so that what interests me is to talk about real impact. Can you give us examples of how your presence on the board has had real impact?
Well, I was very involved, and I'm still very involved, but I was a lot more involved in Mass MoCA when Timur Galen was the chairman. We have a wonderful new chair who's Mariko Silver, who's somebody who I have a huge amount of respect for. I've known her for a long time as well. She's actually also the president of the Henry Luce Foundation in New York, and she's the new chair of Mass MoCA. But I'm a little bit less involved now because we've already done a lot of the work. And what do I mean by that? There has been a change at Mass MoCA, and that change came with the new director that we appointed. And Christy Edmonds, who's the current director at Mass MoCA, is just a force of nature. She is totally transforming the institution, and she's building on a lot of the work that we did in Joe Thompson's tenure, and in that liminal space during the pandemic where we had to lay off a lot of the employees of the museum. We had to look at a change in direction and at a change at leadership at the museum. And so I feel like the work that we did in the past under Hans Morris and then ultimately also under Timur Galen's chairmanship set the tone for a lot of these changes that are being implemented now by Christy Edmonds. And what that means is that we're really talking about strategic planning at the moment. We're looking at the next 7 years of what MoCA and what that means. And we're actually building on the fact that we've made a lot of progress in sustainability as stewardship. That's what we call it, sustainability as stewardship, which means that we're taking increased responsibility to improve what we call the physical, emotional, and creative conditions that apply to the resources, the creative resources of the institution, but also to the people who work there, the people who, as I said, visit the institution, and actually even just the land stewardship, the environment that surrounds Mass MoCA. And we're doing this in a really holistic way, and we're building on the fact that it's an institution that is beloved because it's got its civic responsibilities, it's got community partnerships, and a lot of that is actually more interesting than when I joined 7 years ago because there are people who've come in from Ukraine, there are people who come in from New York, from Brooklyn. There are black people, there's brown people, there's indigenous people, there's Latinos. All of them feel like they're starting to belong in an institution. Whereas when I joined 7 years ago, people expressed to me that they felt isolated because of the fact that it was just so white and kind of so monolithic in its approach to contemporary art.
But the community itself is not a very diverse community, is it?
The community itself is not diverse, and it is true that there's been a lot of pain because it was a working class neighborhood that was transformed through this incredible museum. And there are a lot of people who still feel neglected, who still feel that these changes, these accelerations in digital technology that are transforming the community, these artistic creations that are transforming the community are not for them. So every time I go there, I see a lot of Trump signs in the backyards because, they want to go back to a different time. However, what I've noticed is that there are a lot of people who came in with new ideas. A lot of people moved from urban areas in the Northeast, from Boston, from New York, from other cities to North Adams and surrounding cities because they wanted to bring a different perspective to that um, environment that is really at the nexus of an academic institution, which is Williams College, other cultural institutions in the area, and Mass MoCA has become a bit of a hub for new ideas that are emanating from new people who are not from the Berkshires, but who feel like the Berkshires could become their new home because more and more people are coming from different parts of the Northeast, America, and quite frankly, even the world to rebuild that community and make it a little bit more diverse and inclusive.
And you do feel your presence on the board has contributed to this.
I do because I was working hand in hand with Timmer and with the other trustees to implement things related to diversity, related to sustainability, related to collaboration and synergies. And actually, I was on the executive committee, I was on the diversity committee, I was head of the institutional advancement committee, which is the development committee, which is basically fundraising. I was also on the search committee when we had to find a new director and interviewed dozens and dozens of candidates. So I spent a lot of time over the last 3, 4 years trying to be part of this group that would help to reinvent Mass MoCA. And the arrival of Christy Edmonds has just been just so kind of life affirming in a way. It's a bit of a sea change, it's a cultural shift. And that cultural shift could be seen in the programming, where we really are embracing artistic freedom, again, from an angle of diversity, really supporting artists that, create the conditions to actually lean into, yes, you can do this. And yes, we will have people to help you. And no, you are not alone. And this means that we have to attract more and more resources, including financial resources. And that's happening slowly.
As you know, I know Christy because she was at UCLA Live, and so I know her quite well. And we were it was a loss for us in Los Angeles to have her leave, but I think it was a great step for her.
Yeah, I actually spoke to a friend who's also chair of a board at a very important New York cultural institution, who was also trying to woo Christie as the director of that New York-based cultural institution. It didn't happen, and we're very lucky at Mass MoCA to have her as our new captain.
Is the board more diverse now?
The board is a lot more diverse now. There are wonderful people who came over the last 7 years, and they all brought different perspectives. It feels um, a little bit less like a state of homophily, which is kind of like what I saw before. It's almost like you look like me, I like you. You went to Williams College, come and join the board. You're from around here, you have ties to this community, come and join the board. Now I feel that there are people coming in from all over, and we have other people who've been on the board for a while who are hopefully going to be a little bit more engaged. Um, Hans Ulrich Obrist, who you might know from the Serpentine, is
Of
also
course,
on the board, and he's just a really powerful thinker when it comes to reinvention of museums. And I think that having his perspective and having other perspectives coming from different parts of America, Christie, Los Angeles, as you said, by way of other places, by way of Australia and other places, I just think that it's putting Mass MoCA on the map in the way that it wasn't before. Even though Mass MoCA always had this reputation as this great museum that allowed great artists like James Turrell and others to do incredible work, that was great. But I feel like now we're about to take it to the next level.
was it difficult to be the first board member who represented diversity?
It was. It was. It's always difficult to be the only one. I've often been in that situation, whether it was being one of the first, either academic institutions where I studied or, work environments where I was really active. And there were times where, I kind of felt like, wow, I'm like the house Negro here because, you know, I'm just here listening, but nobody understands my perspective or my lived experience. And even though Timmer and the other board members were very supportive and open to hearing my ideas, I feel like my experience was so different from theirs. And obviously, there's a lot of people who are very privileged. There are a lot of patrician trajectories, inherited wealth, and a lot of situations that are very different from how most people live. And so, what I try to do is bring a different perspective, the perspective of, an immigrant from Africa who's also French, who came to America, as I said, as a penniless immigrant and built something, but is still very rooted in the reality of some artists who are completely destitute. I've kind of come up with a lot of artist friends, and some have made it, some have become very famous. Friends like Kehinde Wiley or Rashid Johnson, and they become really big artists. But a lot of my other friends are just living hand to mouth, still 20 years into the game, and I try to bring a lot of that realness to the discussions at the board meeting levels at Mass MoCA. And in the beginning, it felt like time that it was kind of falling on deaf ears because a lot of people really on the board, they just can really relate to that. Truthfully, though, there's been a lot of progress made because the majority of the board has always been very progressive. And I feel like the leadership that Timur Galen brought in this transition period with very, very, very difficult kind of macroeconomic conditions, the pandemic, the change in leadership, uh, the crisis, from a financial level. I feel like he navigated that, and his stewardship really let us make a decision, which really was about bringing a fearless leader like Christy on board, who embraces all of that because she is all of that, and she's got a network that is now leaning in a pretty big way.
So I love your positive energy. So basically, we're on a trajectory towards something that's good. Unlike just listening to the news, where when we listen to the news, we don't necessarily think that we're on a trajectory towards something good. But your story with Mass Mocha is that, right?
Absolutely, because I felt, to be honest, that it was an institution that was a little bit set in its ways, that had resources coming in from a few people who were extremely privileged and wanted to be benefactors and patrons of the arts, and who were really putting their money where their mouth is, but who perhaps didn't have the direct understanding of the crisis in which we've been living and how certain artists are really struggling spiritually, financially, and so on. And because I felt that some of these trustees were a little bit removed from what was actually happening, I felt that there was a group that I feel like I was part of that really helped to bring a lot of the very difficult decisions to the agenda. And I believe that those decisions actually led to this really positive outcome, which is an extraordinary leader like Christy Edmonds, who's now backed by uh, a really open-minded chair like Mariko Silver. And that's why I feel like things need to happen in stages. There was the Hans Morris phase, which was really interesting because it was growth. And then there was the Timur Galen phase, which was about transition and managing a very, very difficult transition. He had a really difficult job. And now I feel like the phase is going to be about expansion. And I have to say, Timur is really the one who pushed us in that direction for Christy because he saw in her this incredible fire, this incredible passion. We all saw it in her, but he saw it in her before any of us did. And that is the sign of a true leader who can actually transform institutions and understand that sometimes it's great to move on and let other people to build on the legacy.
Fantastic. So now tell us, it's more recently that you've gone on the board at MoMA PS1. So tell us a little bit about how did that happen? How did you and why did you decide to join this very older, or much older institution as MoMA PS1?
Well, MoMA PS1 is just as old as me. It was actually created in 1971, so I feel like we were born in the same year, and yeah, and so it kind of made sense for me to join that board because I met Sarah Arison, who's now the chair of the board, a few years ago, maybe 8 years ago, and she had been running an organization called Young Arts, and
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Young Arts in Miami, and
yeah,
she still
yeah.
runs that wonderful institution, which I kind of work with when I was the president of the Watermill Foundation, that foundation that was created by Bob Wilson out in Watermill, New York, in the East End, to support artists through artists residencies and creative collaboration programs. So Sarah Arison was a big supporter of the Watermill Foundation, and I worked with her in that capacity, and I got to know her. And when she became chair, I got to meet some of the other trustees, people like Robert Soros, and people that I have a huge amount of admiration for. And more importantly, the longtime chair was Aggie Gunn.
Uh,
And I have to say, and I have been in the Aggie Gunn congregation for a while. I worship that woman. And,
yeah,
Sarah is a bit of an heir to Aggie Gunn, and just the idea of working with women like Aggie Gunn, women like Sarah Arison, leaders like Robert Soros, that to me, that was just everything. But actually, it went back to 20 years ago, which was shortly after I moved to New York. My big brother, another one of my mentors, Okwi and Wazor, who became a really powerful and influential curator in the contemporary art world, he had actually brought me as his sidekick and in some ways sparring partner when he was curating this incredible show in 2002 2003. It was called the Short Century, and the exhibition at MoMA PS1 back then, I think back then it was called just PS1. It was 20 years ago. It was about independence and liberation movements in Africa from 1945 to 1994, which was basically
oh, I don't know that. I don't know the exhibit. I'm surprised. I don't know it. I'll have to look it up.
it went to the Tate Modern in London. It was a really great exhibit because it spoke a little bit to my own family history, but it explored African culture through art, film, photography, architecture, music, literature, theater, all the things that I was interested in with my own publication trays. But it featured work from artists from all over the African continent, and it talked about African liberation, how politics collide with culture, with economics, and I was there when Okui was producing and curating that show at PS1. And I started kind of being more interested in the institution. So I started over the years meeting more and more artists who exhibited there. Then I found out that Mina, who runs the restaurant on the ground floor of PS1, she actually used to work with me at Trace magazine in New York. So I had a lot of connections, and it felt like everything was pulling me towards PS1. And so when I joined as a trustee in February of this year, it almost felt like a homecoming.
So this, I presume, is this the MoMA PS1 board more diverse?
Oh, the MoMA PS1 board is more diverse than the Mass MoCA board, but I still believe it's not diverse enough. And so, what I
Mhm.
mean by that is if you look at the population in Queens, right, and Long
Yeah.
Island City, where MoMA PS1 is based, one of the most diverse parts of America. If you look at the population of New York City, right, the most diverse city in America, if you look at those populations, I believe that those populations and those demographic makeups need to be reflected at the very, very highest level of these cultural institutions. And that means that the board should be even more diverse than it is.
So I presume that's among the. So what do you have as objectives as being a board member at MoMA PS1?
Well, the first objective is always going to be about diversity because I've spent my entire adult life bringing diversity to media, diversity to education, diversity to venture capital, and now diversity to museums and cultural institutions. And so I believe that we need to have more diverse voices. And I don't just mean more Black people, more Latinos, more women. I mean people who come from different professional environments,
Of course.
people who come from different industries. Not everyone needs to come from the world of finance. Not everybody, needs to come from the world of real estate. We need people who come from the creative industries, entrepreneurs who might have experimented with new models in the creative industries. And I think that we need more artists, more practitioners on the board. And so for me, if I can just move the needle a little bit by working with the other trustees, that will be success. Of course, in order to sustain the institution, which is part of MoMA, we need to fundraise. And so I'm the co chair of the annual MoMA PS1 Gala, which is taking place next week on May 10th.
Wow.
And so for that, I bought a table, I sold tickets to friends so they could support the museum and the work of the artists who actually are connected to the museum. So it's about general operating support, but it's also about supporting artists and supporting the grand plan for this capital campaign that was about taking MoMA PS1 to the next level. Because people kind of see us as an institution that is part of MoMA, so they just imagine that because of the MoMA imprimatur, there's a lot of money there, but they don't realize that we still have to raise our own money in order to keep it going. Quite frankly.
I wonder now if you could give me some just general views on all these various diversity initiatives that are happening at the museums and other arts institutions. I presume you have a more general view of what's going on and if you think it's been effective.
Well, it's interesting that you're asking me this question because I was just reflecting on that a few days ago. And I was reflecting on the fact that ever since George Floyd was killed in May of 2020, and literally that was 3 years ago, I must have had 12 or 13 major cultural institutions who reached out to me to test my interest in me joining their board as a trustee. And these are some of the most important museums in America. I've even had museums in Europe reach out to me with that same objective. Even though Europe doesn't think about diversity in the same way as America does,
Yeah.
they've asked me to join the board as well. And I just realized that many people who are the gatekeepers at these museums didn't realize what a problem this lack of diversity was. And they woke up after George Floyd was murdered, and this kind of racial reckoning became topic A in America that year. But the reality is, if you don't even consider it to be a problem, how are you going to start looking for people who are outside of your immediate circles? Many of these trustees know people who work in the same industries, who come from the same academic backgrounds, and it becomes pretty insular. So my strength, I believe, is that I'm able to navigate multiple worlds all the time. I'm able to be in the world of black culture, but I'm also in the world of the Silicon Valley elite. I'm also in the world of Harvard and MIT, and I'm also in the world of young entrepreneurs in Togo, and I'm also in the world of emerging artists and writers in France, and uh, music makers coming out of London. So because I'm navigating all these worlds at the same time, I'm able to identify people who could be great candidates for the board, but also great candidates to support these cultural institutions in other ways, not just by giving money, which is what people associate with being a trustee. And I think that that's a real asset. And that's probably why so many cultural institutions have reached out to me to see if I was perhaps interested in becoming a trustee.
I think it all sounds great. I do think, as an aside, that I mean, I like you, I live between Europe and the United States and travel pretty much all over the world. And I am shocked each time I come back to Europe as a lack of dialogue about these issues. And the Europeans then think that what's happening in America is so awful and is so tough. But I try to explain to them that we're talking about it. That's the first step to be able to make a wrong right, is to talk about it. And I have definitely seen a change, as you say, since George Floyd. So it's the one bit of positives. Is certainly my world is super sensitive to these issues and talking about them in a way that did not happen previously.
That's a problem that I have as a French citizen.
Yeah.
And you and I know, Scott, that the French Republic is indivisible, which
Yes.
means that we're never supposed to talk about racial identity,
Yeah.
really, quite frankly, about cultural differences. And, I've been talking about this pretty much for 25 years, ever since I became a journalist and a magazine editor and publisher, that I've been talking about this every month on almost every issue. And when I go back to France now, I get into so many arguments with my friends, with even, black African friends who are perhaps living in France, who were born and raised in France. They're, as my friend Thomas Chatterton Williams, the writer, wrote, they are in a panic over what they call le wokisme,
Yeah.
and that just is so funny. Actually, Thomas wrote an article for The Atlantic a couple of months ago, which was really great because his headline was around the fact that France has rejected identity politics, and that rejection of identity politics has made him recalibrate his own views on woke ideology. And the French just feel like this wokeism is just a US thing, and it was just accelerated and amplified by the discussion that followed George Floyd's murder. And if you actually look at what's happening in France right now, a lot of my friends that I came up with, many of them never actually reached the top. They never actually got any really big jobs in government. They never actually ran any big companies or created any big companies because, the whole concept of affirmative action and just recognizing that, for instance, oh, wow, we need a different perspective at the top of this company or at the top of this institution is not something that should ever be discussed. And as a result,
No,
it's like my dad used to
they're not
say,
even they're not
there's
even
no
conscious of
solution
this.
because there's no problem.
That's right. They're not even conscious of this. We should talk about this more another time because also my French world has said to me that they find me too woke, which I think is ridiculous.
That's and that's why um the whole woke thing is obviously always debated here in America, but I think that it needs to be redefined with the American experiment in mind and looking at what France's history with colonialism and actually integrating other cultures has been. Because, France has more Black people, more Muslim people than any other country in Europe, right? So it's the most diverse country in that sense. And unless France confronts its problem with diversity and the fact that many diverse French people like myself, are sometimes considered second class citizens, unless France is able to confront that in a way that perhaps Tocqueville explored the tensions and contradictions within America when he published Democracy in America in 1835. Unless France is able to do that now, there will be a reckoning. It won't be just a racial reckoning, but it'll also be driven by this stigmatization that comes with being a French Muslim, for instance. And so, le
Because if you
wokisme
see
is
what
a
I keep
really big
saying to our
debate.
what I keep saying to our French friends, because I'm sure you do the same thing, that if you cannot articulate the issue and discuss it, you will not be able to resolve it. And they do not even articulate it.
That's exactly it.
It's terribly frustrating.
It is, and there's usually always one token um, black person in the French government, or one woman who's supposed to be a feminist,
Yeah.
kind of talking about these issues. But that person usually has to deal with dissent within the government. And actually, when you look at the results, none of these ministers have been able to achieve anything with respect to what they call equality of chances. So it's another debate that we should have. And so, in that respect, I'm much happier operating out of New York and out of the US than I would be out of Paris right now.
Okay, so Claude, as I mentioned to you a bit earlier, sometimes you want to talk about um, things that are in the news, and I would like to know what you think about how important it is for arts institutions to be considering the origin of their donors' wealth. And at what point does that stop? And in particular, as I told you, I was intrigued by this recent ending of an artist boycott in Finland. And what happened over a controversy over the Zabludovic support. And the Finnish National Museum has just come out with new guidelines concerning ethical funding. And according to these new guidelines, the ties with the Zabludovic collection have been ended. And I'm intrigued about this because, if I understand correctly, the Zabludovic fortune, that is, Peugeot's father, was involved in arms dealing for Israel. But I think that Peugeot, who is the donor, no longer has any ties to this kind of activity, but he does support Israel. So it's a very curious situation. And it says, I mean, if you want, I can read to you what they can. It says the museum, this is the Finnish National Museum, and they call it as ethical funding guidelines. And they say the museum will refuse donations from organizations sanctioned by the Finnish government or those affiliated with oil and gas production, the tobacco industry, weapons manufacturing, or the production of environmentally hazardous chemicals. The regulations also forbid the museum to establish ties with organizations or other bodies whose operations promote oppression of minorities or human rights violations, authoritarian governance, gender inequality, or criminal activities. Voila. So, I mean, how can you disagree with the guidelines? I mean, you can't disagree with it, but do you then refuse involvement if someone's ancestors were involved with these issues? I don't know. So I just wondered about your thoughts on that.
These are important debates that might have started as just discussions, but ended up being debates that could actually lead to legislation. And I get that. And I think that we have to look at where the money came from. And I think that it's important to trace it back. What you're describing with the Finnish art workers and artists who began protesting Helsinki's Museum of Contemporary Art, that is something that I actually experienced firsthand when I was showing my film, The Great Green Wall, at the Zurich Kunsthaus, which is actually Switzerland's largest art museum. I produced a film called The Great Green Wall, and there was a screening in 2021 at in Zurich at the Kunsthaus. And what happened was, um, people were nervous. The staff of the museum were nervous because of the media scrutiny that came with the fact that a lot of the masterpieces in that museum, which again is Switzerland's largest art museum, these Monets, these Cezannes, these Van Goghs, these Degas, they came from an industrialist called Bourle. He actually had died, I think, in
Oh yes,
1955 or 56,
yeah,
and he made his fortune selling arms to Nazi Germany, and
yeah.
there people were
Horrible
like, well, why
guy.
are we still accepting these masterpieces as kind of the central nodes of this museum? And I was like, well, you have to confront the past, the very, very dark past of these people, these horrible people who just happen to have made a lot of money by making horrible decisions, truly unethical. I don't think you can just get away with it because generational wealth means that it could be whitewashed after a while. And as a result, I'm really, really happy that these Finnish artists and workers at the museum are actually taking a stance. To me, it's really about a much larger issue, which is how certain museums just get co-opted by big money, regardless of where that money is coming from. Of course, many people have talked about the situation with the Sacklers, and I'm very, very proud to announce that even before the New Yorker published that article on the Sacklers and all their dirty money linked to OxyContin, I had told Bob Wilson when I was president of the Watermill Foundation that I should not really ever engage in a conversation where you even think about taking Sackler money, even though the Sacklers had been longtime donors to the Watermill Foundation. I was like, no, we're not doing this. And Bob Wilson and I had a really honest discussion, and it led to a decision, which is a good decision because dirty money is not the kind of money that institutions that are about proper culture and transmission to the youth should be taking.
For me, it seems clear that boards have to think about the origin of their donors' wealth. This is clear. And it's clear to me as well that in the case of the Sacklers clearly knew what they were doing. They knew what was going on. And the people that the actual donors were making money off this horrible situation about which they were totally aware. So the situation with the Sacklers to me is very clear. This is clear, and that's a clear ethical line.
No, I would
Less
have to
clear,
disagree. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to
but
disagree. Not
please.
all the Sacklers were participants in this scheme. It's a big family, and some Sacklers have that name, and they are Sacklers, but they were not participants in the way that other branches of the family were. And so I think we have to be really clear. However, because their name is so tainted, it's important to draw the line and not take any Sackler money, is my opinion.
I agree with you entirely. So the question is, what happens if it's a previous generation? I mean, is it sufficient to have some kind of historical discourse about it and accept the donations, or do we not accept involvement with donors whose past, like in the case of Zabludovic, is clearly has unethical past?
Yeah, I think the we should draw the line and we shouldn't accept those donations. It's almost like the debate at Princeton University around the Woodrow Wilson School. A very, very racist American president having his name on a major school at Princeton University
Yeah,
is a problem. And it
yeah.
took the activism of students to actually address that issue. And I feel like what we're discussing with respect to Zablodovic is the same thing, really. It's just a different context. We have to look at the history of where this money, where this power, where this influence came from. And we need to course correct now because otherwise we'd be setting a really horrible example for future generations that are, quite frankly, a lot more conscious than my generation has been.
Then the other news timely and related situation, which I wanted to talk to you about, was about Michael Milken. And it seems that this Milken Global Initiative has, has become kind of the United States Davos, and of course, I don't think anybody forgets that he is a convicted felon who has been pardoned by President Trump. and he was a convicted felon, and he basically accepted a guilty plea for violating U.S. securities in 1989, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison and $600 million fine, which presumably meant it was what he did was serious. Later, the sentence was reduced to 2 years because he had a cooperation agreement. But I think so. The issue that I wanted to ask you about is people using their charitable philanthropic activities to whitewash their past. It would appear that Milken, who is now worth, I guess, about $6 billion, has been successful in doing this with his family foundation's involvement in various healthcare um, philanthropies, and now with this very high profile Milken Global Initiative, it seems he has been pretty successful to whitewash his past. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that people should not be judged on their very worst day and the very worst decision they make in their life. I always believe that people should be given a second chance. I'm not saying that Michael Milken is a good person. That's not at all what I'm saying. I don't know Michael Milken, but I do think what he's created with the Milken Institute and the Milken Global Conference is interesting. It's interesting because it's a conference for financiers that are actually funding interesting projects for some of them are anyway. And I launched the Equity Alliance um, symposium there just a couple of days ago in partnership with Linda French Gates' Pivotal Ventures because it was a great place to bring
Yeah.
together people who want to fund venture capital and startups that are, in our case, driven by women or people of color. So we had to go to where the money is, right? It's almost like that joke around, oh, why do you rob banks? And this guy said, because that's where the money is, right? So we went to Milken because that's where the money is, and we need money to fund these startups, these tech startups. So I'm not mad at the idea of the of the Clinton Global Initiative or Milken Global Conference or Concordia or all these initiatives that are about bringing philanthropists and funders and investors and founders together. What I do have a problem with, though, is this mindset whereby certain people think that just because they give money, they can just change the world. And it reminds me of a wonderful book that I read a few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago when it first came out. I don't know if you know this book, Scott, but it's called Winners Take All. And it's about the elite charade of
I don't know.
changing the world. And,
Ah,
do you remember that book? It's by Anand Giri Daradas. He's a wonderful
yeah.
writer who used to write for the New York Times and other publications. And he actually talked about the global elite, people like Michael Milken, and how they're always talking about changing the world, but that actually this objective of theirs, which is about changing the world, ends up preserving the status
It's
quo
just, yeah.
and actually helps them to pay less in taxes through their philanthropy. And actually, if you actually look at the problems they actually solve, the jury is out. And so it was a really interesting book. So in my job, I try to delineate and try to identify those who are truly committed to changing the world versus those who are just paying lip service because it's good for their PR, it's good for their 501c3 donation status, and it's good for essentially their ability to have something to say at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
And the other topic that I wanted to discuss with you, going back to your activities as a board member of these arts institutions, is that I think I mentioned to you that I'm working a bit with someone else on this topic of looking at the unsustainable and incoherent business model of museums. That it's one of the maybe the only institution that begins a year having no idea where they do not have sufficient funds for their operations, and they just believe it will work out. And I think actually what is intrigues me is we hear a lot about all of these diversity issues, but can you really fundamentally address diversity if the institution has an incoherent business model and how it is funded? Anyway, so you as a board member, and it intrigues me that you have many or most of the board members are successful business people, and they sit on these boards for which they have a fiduciary responsibility, but they don't apply coherent business terms to running it.
I think that you have hit the nail right on the head, Scott. And I do believe that it's great to have really, really strong business minds leading these cultural institutions, specifically in times of crisis. I mentioned the incredible work that Timur Galen did in this very, very difficult period at MoCA when he was chairman. And if he had not been such a strong business leader with experience leading teams at Goldman Sachs and Disney and related and other institutions, I don't think the museum would have survived.
Yeah.
I think that had he not made those decisions, including ultimately leading the charge and making sure that we brought in Christy Edmonds as director, I just don't see how Mass MoCA could have had a future because it was touch and go. It was like that, and you need a really, really strong business mind to navigate those choppy waters. And I don't mean that everybody needs to have worked in corporate America and the C-suits in corporate America to do this. And I see the work that Sarah Arison is doing at Mass MoCA. She is a philanthropist and a patron of the arts who run Young Arts, but she's not run a corporation in the way that Timur has. And she's bringing a lot of skills and intelligence and emotional intelligence to making decisions that are still very much driven by the bottom line and our ability to fundraise towards sustainability for the museum. But she's doing it with a different level of empathy, a different level of sense making, which is perhaps a little bit um, uh, different from the way that some of the corporate executives that I've worked with apply lenses that are just all about return on an investment.
Well, thank you, Claude, for taking the time to come and talk to us.
It's been
And
a
I hope
pleasure.
we and I hope we will, I'm sure you and I will continue the discussion. And I hope to see you soon in France or somewhere else.
Yes, we'll find a way to see each other. Thank you, Scott.
Be sure to check out our latest podcast and subscribe to Giving Back is Dead.